In 1837, Lancaster County was torn apart by whispers of four sisters, each bound by blood, each tied to death. A missing farmhand, poison at the church table, a widow gone without a trace. Were they cursed or were they killers? Stay with me and decide for yourself. If you enjoy these journeys into the past, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss a story from our nation's shadows. And tell me in the comments, would you have trusted them? In the year 1837, Lancaster County sat quietly on the rolling farmlands of Pennsylvania. From the outside, it was a community that prided itself on order, faith, and tradition. The people were hard-working farmers, bound by the rhythm of the seasons and the ringing of the church bell that called them each Sunday to worship. To travelers passing through, Lancaster might have seemed like an unremarkable place-rose of tilled earth. Barns leaning under the weight of time, and a people content with their simple existence. But beneath that image of serenity, there was an undercurrent of fear and suspicion that never made its way into the town records. Rural life in the 19th century was not just about planting and harvesting. It was about survival, and survival bred secrets. Families carried feuds for decades. Neighbors rarely trusted one another fully. And when tragedy struck, it was often easier to explain it away with whispers of curses, of sins hidden behind closed doors, or of God's hand passing judgment. The year itself was difficult. Harsh rains ruined crops early in the spring, and by summer, food was scarce. Tensions rose among neighbors who began to count every kernel of corn, every loaf of bread, with suspicion in their eyes. In towns like Lancaster, faith was a shield against despair, but it was also a weapon used to condemn anyone who stepped too far from the path of tradition. And it was in this world where poverty, superstition, and rigid morality collided that the story of four sisters began to take shape. The sisters were not born into privilege, nor were they strangers to hardship. Their small farmhouse stood on the outskirts of Lancaster, its windows dark, and its shutters always closed, even during the day. The land around it was said to be poor for farming, yet the family clung to it with a stubbornness that puzzled the townsfolk. Unlike most families, they rarely joined gatherings or celebrations. When they appeared in public, they moved as one, four figures standing close together, their eyes fixed on the ground or darting toward anyone who stared too long. People would later say they remembered feeling uneasy around them, though at the time no one could explain why. Perhaps it was the silence that followed the sisters wherever they went, as if the world itself paused when they entered a room. Perhaps it was the mother who walked a step behind them, her face stern and shadowed by the bonnet she never removed. Or perhaps it was something more subtle, a kind of heaviness that hung over their presence, like a storm that refused to break. The truth was that Lancaster County in 1837 was not ready for them. The town was built on rules, and the sisters seemed to live outside of them. Their story was not one that could fit neatly into sermons or town records. It was a story that would unfold in whispers, in disappearances, in tragedies that no one dared speak too loudly about. And before long, their names would become synonymous with fear. The farmhouse of the four sisters was little more than a sagging frame of timber and stone, its roof patched with mismatched shingles, its walls weathered by decades of storms. It stood at the very edge of Lancaster County, where farmland gave way to stretches of woods and a shallow creek that seemed to swallow sound. Children walking past on errands were said to hurry their steps, sometimes whispering a prayer under their breath. Even in daylight, the place looked abandoned until one of the sisters appeared in the doorway, watching. Always watching. Their father was long gone by 1837. Some claimed he had died suddenly. Others muttered that he had run off under mysterious circumstances. And a few swore he had been driven from the house by his own daughters. None could prove what had truly happened. All that remained was their mother, a stern woman whose presence weighed as heavily on the family as the sagging beams of the farmhouse itself. She rarely spoke in town, but when she did, her words carried the sharpness of a blade. To her daughters, she was not a source of comfort, but a shadow of constant judgment. Each sister bore her mark in a different way. Eleanor, the eldest, had inherited her mother's severity. She quoted scripture with the certainty of a preacher, twisting verses into commands for her sisters. Townsfolk who encountered her described the way she fixed them with a gaze that felt more like a warning than a greeting. Eleanor believed rules were meant to be enforced, and when she spoke, the others listened. Margaret, the second-born, was her opposite in manner, but not in intent. She was quiet, reserved, and meticulous, often carrying a small notebook in which she wrote lines no one else was allowed to read. Neighbors sometimes glimpsed her in the fields, standing still as though she were memorizing every crack of the soil, every crow circling overhead. Those who dared speculate wondered if her pages held prayers or curses. Catherine, the third, had no patience for quiet or scripture. She was fiery, quick-tempered, and known to lash out at those who crossed her. More than once, she had been seen shoving another girl at market, or arguing loudly with a farmer twice her size. There was talk of her breaking a boy's nose with a stone during a quarrel, though no one ever pressed charges. Where Eleanor ruled with faith and Margaret with silence, Catherine ruled with rage. Lydia, the youngest, was perhaps the strangest of them all. Withdrawn and pale, she spoke little to strangers, but was often seen muttering to herself. Some children whispered that she talked to shadows or carried on conversations with people no one else could see. Others swore they had seen her standing barefoot by the creek in the dead of night, her white dress glowing faintly in the moonlight. Lydia seemed untethered, caught between this world and something beyond it. The sisters' bond was unshakable. They moved together through the town like a single, four-headed creature, Eleanor leading, Margaret watching, Catherine bristling, and Lydia drifting silently behind. They rarely mingled, rarely smiled, rarely broke their formation. To outsiders, they were unsettling. To each other, they were all they had. It was said that even within their home, they lived by a code no one else could understand. Meals were eaten in silence. Chores were divided with military precision. And every evening, neighbors claimed to see a faint lantern glow through the farmhouse window as the sisters gathered together in the parlor, whispering. What they spoke of, no one knew. Some said it was prayer. Others believed it was planning. Whatever it was, it drew them closer, made them sharper, and set them apart from the rest of Lancaster. By 1837, the sisters were already a source of speculation, of unease. And though no crime had yet been proven, suspicion was circling like a vulture over their home. It began quietly, the way so many tragedies in Lancaster did. A young farmhand by the name of Thomas Hale, a drifter who had been working odd jobs across the county, was last seen walking toward the sisters' homestead. He had been hired to help mend the sagging barn roof, and by all accounts, he was grateful for the work. He was strong, willing, and not known to be troublesome. But after that day, Thomas Hale was never seen again. At first, no one panicked. Men like him often vanished, moving on to the next county, the next field, the next chance at a better wage. But when a week passed, then too, whispers began. His pack, containing a spare shirt and a worn Bible, was found in the grass behind the sisters' barn. One boot lay beside it, as though discarded mid-stride. Yet there was no sign of a struggle, no blood, no tracks leading away. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed him whole. The sisters offered no answers. When questioned, Eleanor spoke on behalf of the others, her tone firm and unyielding. He worked one day, then left before dawn. If he abandoned his belongings, that is his sin, not ours. The sheriff, A tired man already burdened with too many disputes among farmers took her word and filed no charge. To him, Thomas was just another runaway laborer. But to the people of Lancaster, the silence was deafening. Neighbors recalled seeing Thomas linger near the farmhouse days earlier, speaking with Catherine at the edge of the field. She had been laughing an uncommon sound from any of the sisters, and he had seemed nervous. Afterward, he kept his distance from the others, especially Lydia, who some swore had been watching him from the upper window of the house, her face pale as a ghost's in the glass. The whispers grew sharper. They know what happened to him. He went into that house and never came out. The sisters don't. Need men, they take them. By autumn, mothers were warning their sons not to linger near the farmstead, and fathers muttered that someone should ride out and search the property. Yet no one did. Fear held them back, fear of what they might find, or worse, fear of the sisters themselves. In the years that followed, Thomas Hale's disappearance would be called the first crime of Lancaster County. Not because there was proof, not because there was justice, but because it marked the moment the sisters' home ceased to be a place of suspicion and became, instead, a place of dread. And dread has a way of growing. By the spring of 1837, the unease that surrounded the sisters had settled over Lancaster like a fog. Thomas Hale's disappearance was never solved, and though the sheriff closed the matter, the townsfolk did not. Whispers followed the sisters whenever they came into town, and their presence at gatherings grew rarer still. But one Sunday evening, against their usual pattern, they appeared at the church supper. It was a long-standing tradition in Lancaster County, each family bringing their best dish to share in the wooden hall beside the church. Neighbors laughed, children played, and for one evening the hardships of farming life seemed lighter. When the sisters entered, silence crept across the room. Eleanor carried herself like a matron, stiff-backed and unsmiling. Margaret followed, clutching a basket. Catherine scowled at anyone who stared too long, while Lydia drifted at the rear, her gaze fixed on the floorboards. From their basket came a pie, golden and sweet-smelling, which Margaret placed neatly among the other offerings. No one dared speak, though several exchanged uneasy glances. The sisters rarely contributed to such events, and their sudden participation was as startling as it was suspicious. At first, the supper passed without incident. Forks scraped plates, hymns were hummed between conversations, and lantern light flickered warmly across the tables. But within the hour, several parishioners began to pale. One woman clutched her stomach and collapsed. An elderly man doubled over, gasping. Panic erupted as two more fell ill, their faces flushed and trembling. By night's end, 2 of Lancaster's elders were dead, their bodies stiff and cold before the doctor could even arrive. Others lingered between sickness and survival for days. The finger of suspicion pointed swiftly and without hesitation. It was their pie, someone whispered. The sisters brought death to the Lord's table. Margaret stood rigid as accusations flew, her hands clasped before her like a child caught in prayer. Eleanor thundered scripture, demanding silence. "Judge not, lest ye be judged." Catherine's eyes blazed with fury. "Do you think we are killers?" She spat at the crowd. And Lydia silent. Pale Lydia rocked slightly where she stood, her lips moving with words no one else could hear. The town divided that night. Some argued the deaths were mere misfortune, the result of spoiled ingredients or careless storage. Others swore it was proof of wickedness, that the sisters had poisoned the faithful as an act of malice or ritual. A few muttered the word that had been hanging unsaid since Thomas Hale vanished: witches. The sheriff again refused to act. Without proof, he claimed, there was no crime, only tragedy. But the townsfolk saw it differently. The sisters had brought something into their midst that defied explanation, and the deaths at the supper were not forgotten. From that night onward, invitations ceased. Doors closed at their approach. Mothers pulled children away when the sisters passed in the market. And though no law had touched them, the sisters were tried and convicted in the court of public opinion. For in Lancaster County, faith and fear were two sides of the same coin, and now both were turned against the daughters of the farmhouse. If Thomas Hale's vanishing had been explained away, and the poisoned pie debated into uncertainty, the next event left no room for doubt in the minds of Lancaster. It was the disappearance of widow Anne Whitfield, a woman known for her sharp tongue, deep pockets, and sharper memory. Anne had lived alone since the death of her husband, keeping to a modest cottage on the edge of town. Though advanced in age, she was far from frail. Her mind was keen. Her voice carried authority, and she was said to keep a small fortune hidden somewhere within her home. She had no children to inherit it, and many whispered that when the time came, her wealth might pass to the church. But in June of 1837, Anne Whitfield vanished. The last sighting came from a merchant at the market, who swore he saw her speaking with Catherine, the third sister. The two were locked in a heated exchange near the grain stalls. Catherine's hands moved sharply as she spoke, while the widow's face reddened with anger. What the argument was about, no one could say, but it was the last time the widow was seen alive. Days later, when neighbors came knocking at her cottage, they found the shutters drawn, the hearth cold, and the door barred from within. When it was finally forced open, the room stood undisturbed except for the absence of Anne Whitfield herself. Her money, her clothing, her personal effects all remained in their places, as though she had simply stepped outside and never returned. Search parties formed. Men scoured the woods, lanterns in hand, their voices calling her name through the night air. Dogs were brought, their noses pressed to the widow's shawl. The trail led them, unerringly, toward the direction of the sisters' land, and then, as if mocking the search, the prince ended abruptly at the edge of the creek behind the farmhouse. Some swore the ground looked disturbed, the mud too recently turned. Others claimed they heard, faintly, the echo of a woman's scream carried across the water on the night of her disappearance. When the sheriff questioned the sisters, Eleanor once again took control. Her words were curt, her face stone. The widow never came here. If she is gone, it is God's will, not ours. Margaret sat silent, her hands folded over her lap, eyes lowered. Catherine glared at the sheriff with barely contained rage. And Lydia stood in the corner, staring at nothing, rocking gently, her lips whispering to the empty air. The sheriff, weary of the town's paranoia, recorded no crime. But for the people of Lancaster, the matter was settled. The sisters had taken Anne Whitfield. Whether for her wealth, her land, or for reasons darker still, no one dared ask Dot from that summer onward. The old farmstead was not just feared, it was hated. Farmers spat when they passed the road leading to it. Women prayed more fiercely in church. And children, wide-eyed and trembling, told each other that if you lingered too long by the sisters' property, you could hear a woman's cry echoing from beneath the ground. The sisters' names had become poison, and with the widow's disappearance, Lancaster knew it was only a matter of time before dread turned into disaster. By autumn, Lancaster County was a tinderbox of fear. 3 tragedies, the vanished farmhand, the poisoned supper, the missing widow, hung over the town like storm clouds. The sheriff's refusal to act had left the people restless. The church pulpit thundered with warnings of sin and God's wrath, and behind every closed door, families whispered the same dark truth. The sisters had gone too far. It was in the dead of night. On an October evening, heavy with fog, that fire lit the sky above the farmhouse. Flames licked upward, right against the black horizon, their glow visible even from the church steeple miles away. The alarm was raised, and men raced with buckets, shovels, and desperation to the sisters' land. By the time they arrived, the house was already an inferno. Windows shattered outward in bursts of sparks. The roof groaned, then caved inward, sending showers of embers into the night air. The smell of burning wood mingled with something sharper, something that made even hardened farmers gag a stench like scorched flesh. Shouts cut through the chaos. Get them out. Where are the sisters? Dear God, they're still inside. But when the blaze at last collapsed into smoldering ash, the truth was grim. 2 bodies were pulled from the wreckage. One, a woman of age, unmistakably their mother, her features twisted beyond recognition. The other, smaller and slighter, was confirmed to be Margaret, the quiet one, her charred notebook still clutched in what remained of her hands. The other 3 sisters were gone. No trace of Eleanor, Catherine, or Lydia could be found in the ruins. At dawn, the county reeled with questions. Had the sisters perished, their bodies consumed by the fire? Or had they set the blaze themselves, burning away their own past before vanishing into the woods? Some whispered that it was no accident, that the fire was divine punishment, God himself erasing their evil from the earth. Others believed it was only the beginning, that the surviving sisters had escaped into the darkness, free to continue their wickedness elsewhere. Children were warned never to wander past the blackened remains of the farmhouse. Travelers crossing the county reported seeing lantern light weaving through the trees, at night 3 figures moving as one, their outlines unmistakably feminine. Farmers swore they heard voices in the distance, chanting, crying, sometimes laughing in a way that froze the blood. The fire of 1837 became the county's breaking point. No one spoke of the sisters with pity anymore. They spoke of them as a curse, a plague that had fallen on Lancaster. With the farmhouse gone, they had no place to pin their hatred but the memories themselves. And those memories would prove harder to burn than timber and stone. The sisters had left, Lancaster in flames literally and figuratively. And though the ashes cooled, the dread they planted would smolder for generations. When the fire burned out, only blackened timbers and scorched earth remained where the farmhouse once stood. For a brief moment, Lancaster County seemed relieved. The curse had been lifted, some said. The sisters were gone, whether dead or vanished into the woods, and with them the terror they had brought. But relief quickly turned to unease, for destruction left behind questions no one wished to answer. The sheriff, weary of his own inaction, filed only a single report: house fire, 2 dead. Cause unknown. No mention of the missing sisters. No mention of the widow, the farmhand, or the poisoned parishioners. It was cleaner that way, easier to write tragedy into silence than to admit that Lancaster had been home to something darker. Church leaders followed suit. From the pulpit, preachers spoke of sin, but not of sisters. They warned the faithful that gossip fed the devil's fire. The names Eleanor, Catherine, Lydia, and Margaret were struck from records, erased from ledgers, omitted from sermons. To speak of them was to give them life, and the county wanted them forgotten. Families, too, learned to hold their tongues. Children who whispered of the sisters by the well or in the fields were hushed by their mothers with sharp looks. Fathers, uneasy in their silence, forbade mention of the fire after dusk. The unwritten law became clear. The sisters never existed, yet the silence only deepened the unease. The blackened ruins of the farmhouse stood for years, avoided by all. No farmer would reclaim the land, though it was fertile. Travelers passing through sometimes camped nearby, only to leave in the night, spooked by sounds they could not explain: footsteps pacing in the ash, a woman's voice murmuring in the dark. But what unsettled Lancaster most was the absence of 3 bodies. If Eleanor, Catherine, and Lydia had perished, the fire had consumed them completely. If they had escaped, they were still out there, watching. The uncertainty gnawed at the county's soul. So the story of the sisters was smothered, pressed down like embers under wet earth. Not out of respect, but out of fear. For in Lancaster County, it was believed that to speak their names was to invite them back. And so, a silence settled, a silence so heavy that even generations later it clung to the county like a shadow, a silence that tried and failed to erase the truth.